What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Thursday, July 25th edition of the Ship My Money Show. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS. We have a weird MLB day today. 6 games starting a little bit after noon Eastern time, and then only 2 games tonight. So, going to talk game by game about this early slate. Not going to have a show later for the 2-gamer. That seems like it would be a really frustrating show to both do and watch. But going to go game by game on this show. So not going to have the tournament show today, unfortunately. I didn't want to things go wrong in the morning, and there was an elevated chance that if I tried to do that show at 10 a.m., it would end up just being one of those shows where it's like, this went completely wrong. This all doesn't matter. So I wanted to do the game by game show instead. It's a little bit easier to navigate around mistakes if they happen. So going to go game by game, talk through the best plays, potential strategy angles. I'll still try and hit on some tournament stuff as well. If you have questions, throw them in chat. I will answer those as always, whether they are slate specific or DFS specific. Don't forget to give the video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications. All of that stuff helps us out. Now, starting with the Nats and the Padres in Washington. Padres went nuts yesterday. That they looked good for me. They came through, so that was nice to see. Dylan Cease going for the Padres today. Patrick Corbin for the Nats. So it's once again probably going to be a Padres day. Corbin not getting any ownership, doesn't deserve it. He's not even that cheap. He's $6,500. So this isn't even a situation where you're looking at him and going, he's $5,000 and he's a starting pitcher. He's correctly priced at $6,500. He's just not a very good pitcher at this point in his career. And then on top of that, he has a really, really difficult matchup against a Padres team that not only has a bunch of power and a bunch of right-handed power, but is also very, very difficult to strike out. Only a 16.5% K percentage for Corbin this year. 4.29 xFIP is probably better than the average person would guess if you just asked somebody that plays MLB DFS, what Corbin's underlying ERA metrics are. They're probably better than people would guess, but they're still not good. Scherer is worse than xFIP at 4.61. They're both better than his 5.35 ERA. But from a DFS standpoint, the strikeouts just aren't there. The matchup is brutal. Pepe, nice call on Vientos. Big, 8th inning for him? Home run and I think a sac fly or something off the bullpen. Mets in general smashed yesterday. Fortunately, in higher, small field, higher stake stuff, nobody had them, so it didn't really matter. But yeah, they came through. Vientos with the homer in, I think it was the 8th inning. So Corbin, no real interest. And then on the other side, Cease is about as obvious a good play as Corbin is a bad one. 38% ownership, 36% chance of being optimal. I also wish I hadn't said that because that's a very obvious clip for when Corbin throws a no-hitter and Cease gets lit up. But Cease looks really, really good here. 9,200 is a really cheap price tag for his strikeout upside. It's not a great strikeout matchup against the Nats. They rank in the bottom 5 in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year at just 19%. They have a 100 WRC plus. So it's not a very good matchup, but $9,200 for a pitcher that has a 32.5% strikeout percentage. That is the best on the slate. 3.14 xFIP. Really, really good pitcher. Really good price tag. Certainly happy getting to as much Cease as I can here. I think the field's pretty much got it right at around 38%. And one thing that I will mention too is that usually when it comes to these top-end pitchers, I think that they're going a little bit over-owned, and then I still end up playing a lot of them since they project well and it's only one spot in my lineup. Usually, if you get a top-end guy like Cease, and I actually think the ownership is correct, I end up really getting to a lot of them. So wouldn't be surprised at all if Cease is just a spot where I'm getting him pretty much everywhere. Offensively, all that I really have to say about the Nats is that Cease is going to be really popular. It is only a 6-game slate, and the Nats offense isn't bad, like I was saying before. So if this were like an 11-game slate, I wouldn't really have anything to say about the Nats because there would just be so many offensive spots that I wouldn't really care too much about that negative correlation in tournaments. With it being a 6-gamer, especially in your large field stuff, there is certainly some merit to just going to the Nats, hoping that Cease has a bad outing, and you've eliminated a very large percentage of entries just because they have Cease. There is that strategy angle in tournaments, particularly your larger field ones. But it's not like anything from the Nats is going to set up or match up particularly well against Cease. It's really just, hoping that he doesn't have good stuff today, in which case then it's good for all of the Nats. Checking quickly, he's been slightly below average at controlling the running game, but nothing glaring. So, like, if CJ Abrams gets on, I assume he's going to run, but it's not like it's a guarantee that he's just stealing, every base when he's on. But it is at least, not a pitcher that's great at holding runners. We saw it yesterday. I mentioned it on the show, and it came through. Bobby Witt got on base multiple times yesterday and never ran on Ryan Nelson. It's not that kind of spot here, so you do get some stolen base upside, or at least the normal stolen base upside from somebody like CJ Abrams if they get on. The Padres are clearly going to look really good. They're grading out as the second best stack overall for me. The first is the best five-man. Corbin gives up power. The Padres have power. They're reasonably priced. 198 expected ISO allowed to righties so far this year for Corbin. 210 to righties since the start of last year. 186 to lefties since the start of last year. 164 this year. Campusano getting the start at catcher. He's only 3K. Higashioka came through as a popular catcher yesterday, which was obviously really annoying if you didn't have him because he's not the type of hitter that ever really should be popular. But you get Campusano here at 3K. It's just a really cheap price tag, especially when you consider that he also positively correlates with all of these other top-end hitters from the Padres. So he's getting about 20% ownership. That is about where I think he should be. Xander Bogaerts, only 4K, getting 18%. Manny Machado, 4,800, getting 21%. I don't have an issue with any of those ownership numbers. I don't have an issue with Ha-Seong Kim, batting sixth at 4,200, getting 17%. I think Jackson Merrill is going overlooked here. Corbin is better against lefties than righties, but it's not like he's elite against them. And Merrill does positively correlate with all these guys that the field is getting to that do project really well. I think Merrill at 8% ownership is going overlooked. Jurickson Profar, 17% ownership warranted. I think Jake Cronenworth going overlooked. So one tournament strategy that I pretty clearly am going to like today is getting to the Padres and just mixing in these left-handed bats in Cronenworth and Merrill because the field is projected to not get to them at the same rate that they're getting to the right-handed bats in this lineup. But everybody else in this lineup projected for at least 10% ownership. So it is a team where if you're getting to them in tournaments, you do want to be aware of what you're doing with the rest of your lineup. Getting to five-man stacks is going to bring in a lot of ownership unless you're mixing in Merrill and Cronenworth, which I do recommend. It's also a team that is perfectly fine to just use them as 2 and 3-mans. Then you get to a lower-owned five-man stack. You're mixing in some of the best one-offs, whether that's Machado, Bogaerts, Campusano, whoever it may be that you need in that lineup, but you're still just not allocating as much ownership to that Padres stack as you would be if you go to a five-man. But from a projection standpoint, they look really good. I haven't built a cash lineup. I wouldn't be surprised if it has 5 Padres. At the very least, I would assume it has a few of them. Just very obviously a good spot for them. Now going to Miami in another very obviously good spot for a good offense. Roderick Munoz on the mound for Miami. Corbin Burnes pitching for the O's. Burnes getting about 34% ownership at 9,500, 35% ownership at 9,500. Keife Higashioka is not in the lineup because it's a day game after a night game, and he caught yesterday. Good matchup for Burnes. It's weird that he's $300 more expensive than Cease, given that his strikeout numbers are nowhere near as good. Burnes striking out 23.5% of hitters this year with a 3.38 xFIP, 3.59 Scherer. Cease, I already mentioned, 32.5% K percentage, so 9 points higher. 3.14 xFIP is better than Burnes. 3.01 Scherer is better than Burnes. So it's weird to see Burnes $300 more. It is a much better matchup. The Marlins are one of the worst offenses in baseball. They rank 11th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year. They have a 90 WRC plus. There's no doubt that it's a better matchup for Burnes, but getting the same amount of ownership as Cease, I do think I probably end up playing Cease a little bit more. Now, that's not to say that I can't just play them together. I don't think that we have a ton of expensive bats that we have to pay for on this slate. So I would expect that I'm getting a good amount of Burnes plus Cease, but I do think Burnes should be a little bit lower owned than Cease is, and right now he's not really projected to be. All of that being said, I'm not trying to say that I don't like Burnes. I don't think he's a bad play at all. It is a good matchup, good park, and he's still a really good pitcher, even though the strikeout stuff hasn't been as good as we've seen in the past from him this year. Munoz on the other side, 6,200, not getting any ownership. I don't really think that he should. I played a bunch of Edward Cabrera yesterday against Baltimore in a scary spot. That worked out well until it didn't. He ended up being fine, but he was on the verge of being like a really, really useful play until he gave up 3 runs in his last inning and lost the win. Munoz, not the same type of pitcher as Cabrera, though. Doesn't have that same sort of strikeout stuff that Cabrera does. 19% strikeout percentage this year, 12% walk percentage, 5.36 xFIP. Cabrera is somebody that is still raw and walks too many guys, doesn't have good control, but has really, really good stuff And when he's on, he's going to strike you out. He has a sub 4 xFIP. Munoz is just more of a not very good pitcher at this point. We did see him string together a few good starts earlier in the season, but that's not what he projects to be at this point. And this is a very, very difficult spot against the Orioles, team that is difficult to strike out, a team that hits really, really well against right-handed pitching this year. Baltimore's active roster ranks 15th in strikeout percentage at 22%. That number has jumped recently, but they also have a 115 WRC plus and a 181 ISO. It is a park downgrade for them, but still a pretty nice spot here against Munoz. And they are showing up as my top stack overall and my second best 5-man stack. I expect that they will be popular along with the Padres. You can see here every hitter except for Mountcastle in the projected lineup I used getting double-digit ownership. We got their lineup like pretty much as I clicked start on this show. So I'm not sure if I have the correct lineup or not. Henderson, Westberg, Santander, O'Hearn, Mountcastle, Cowser, Hayes, Norby, and McCann is the actual lineup. So no Adley Rutschman, who was in my projected lineup. So that's James McCann. Ramon Urias is Connor Norby. Mullins is Austin Hayes. So these three guys are not actually in. I was getting to all three of them. I assume I'll still get to Hayes. I assume I'll still get to Norby. Obviously, Rutschman to McCann is a massive, massive drop-off. I don't expect to get nearly as much McCann as I was Rutschman, but replacing Urias with Norby is a complete non-issue. Replacing Mullins with Hayes is a complete non-issue. So overall, this team is going to get a lot of ownership. They are going to look very good. Munoz, so far this season, again, not a huge sample size in the majors, but he has allowed a 236 expected ISO to lefties, 264 to righties, not striking out guys at a high clip from either side of the plate. So Baltimore is going to look good. Again, the park is not good. It's a downgrade for left-handed power specifically, but Gunnar Henderson still can hit it out anywhere. So can Santander. So they look good. Probably in tournaments, not going to be mixing Baltimore plus Padres too much because of the ownership. But everything I said about the Padres does apply to the Orioles here, where you can 5-man stack them. Just be aware of what you're doing elsewhere in your lineup as far as ownership goes. Or you can use them as 2-mans and 3-mans, get really, really highly projected, good point per dollar plays to mix in with lower owned 5-man stacks. So there's multiple ways to approach them. Connor Norby, I did want to pull up. I don't know off the top of my head what his salary is. I know he was really cheap earlier in the year. Yeah, he's 2,800 on DraftKings. He is batting 8th, so it's not a good spot in the lineup. But Ramon Urias, 2,400, projected to bat 9th, was showing up 17% for me. It's very likely Connor Norby is showing up in that same ballpark as well, even though he is a little bit more expensive. I think for the most part, it's going to be the same type of play, except for Connor Norby does have more power than Ramon Urias does. He is 10th in WRC plus at AAA this season amongst qualified hitters in the International League. He projects for a decent amount of power, projects around a 150 ISO, depending on which projection system you're looking at. 222 ISO at AAA this year. Again, not likely to just step into the major leagues and dominate, but he does project to be an average to slightly below average hitter at this point in his career over the rest of the season. And at 2,800 in a good spot, I'm not going to have any issue getting there. So that's going to look good. Miami on the other side going up against Burns. Basically just rinse and repeat what I said about the Nats, except for they are a worse offense also. But if you're going to them, it is solely because of the ownership coming into Burns. I do think it's more likely in tournaments that I get to the Marlins than the Nats, just because Cease looks better to me than Burns does. But they are basically the same play to me. They are very cheap. So you do get a cheap offense that is low owned, that is facing a popular pitcher, that would allow you to play really good players around them. For example, Cease plus Padres plus Miami would work perfectly fine, especially if it's like a 5-man Miami, 3-man San Diego. That's a solid contrarian lineup. It negatively correlates with Burns. Like a lineup like that, you can clearly see the path to winning, even though it's not going to happen all that often. But again, you're getting one of the worst offenses on the slate going against one of the best pitchers. Looking at this lineup, Xavier Edwards is hitting second. So that is a cheap shortstop hitting second. Again, shitty matchup, but worth noting that he jumped up in the lineup a little bit. Bell, Sanchez, Rivera's at the bottom of the order, but Bell and Sanchez in the middle of the order, both cheap. So very, very cheap offense, just not a good matchup against Burns. Tigers taking on the Guardians in Cleveland in a park that we know has been much better for home runs this year than in the past. Gavin Williams pitching for Cleveland. Kenta Maeda going for the Tigers. very, very tough strikeout matchup for Kenta Maeda. He's getting about 5% ownership. That's pretty much in line with where I think he should be. He is only $5,500, which is just a really, really cheap price tag. But tough strikeout matchup, not a particularly good pitcher overall. About an 18% strikeout percentage, 4.71 xFIP, and 2 home runs allowed per 9 innings as a starter so far this season for Maeda. And then you're getting this Cleveland team that has power and is hitting in a park that plays up power. Maeda expected to be the bulk reliever here. I don't think he's supposed to actually start this game, but he is expected to follow whoever is starting. So ultimately, not somebody I would expect to get in small field stuff. If I'm playing 150 lineups on the 6 gamer, like, yeah, maybe I have 5% or so, but doesn't look very good. Gavin Williams on the other side, I do think is interesting here. He has struggled a bit since returning from the injured list. He's only struck out 17% of hitters. He has a 4.99 xFIP, but this is a pitcher that is supposed to be good at the major league level. Pretty highly regarded pitching prospect. He had success last year in a limited sample when he came up. 82 innings last season, 16 starts, 4.5 xFIP, 3.29 ERA, 4.05 FIP. So got lucky in terms of run prevention, 4.21 expected ERA, but nothing, horrible there. He struck out 23.5% of hitters. He did walk too many with about an 11% walk percentage. But the point here being at 7,800, going up against a Tigers team that isn't particularly good, 14th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching, 96 WRC plus. Williams just looks like a pretty solid mid-range play. He's getting 17% ownership. He showed up as optimal 22% of the time for me. Obviously, I want to be getting to like as much Burns plus Cease, for example, as I can. But where I can't afford that, Gavin Williams does look pretty good. Offensively, both of these stacks I think are going to just be like middle-of-the-road stacks for me. The Guardians do have the better matchup and the higher implied run total going up against Tigers, but you do get the sort of like quasi bullpen game, which isn't the most appealing thing just because it limits the amount of at-bats that you're getting against any particular pitcher. And then on top of that, the Guardians, at least they're good hitters, are pretty expensive. So that makes it tough. 6,100 for Ramirez, plus 5,400 for Naylor, plus 5,700 for Kwan. Not that any of those guys shouldn't be expensive. They do have power. Kwan is hitting for power now, which is something he hasn't done in his career previously. This park plays it up, especially for these guys from the left side. But when you compare that to the pricing on like the Padres specifically, and also on a lot of those Orioles, you're just paying a lot for Cleveland as opposed to those teams. It does make them an interesting tournament team, though, because they clearly have the same sort of upside that Baltimore does, that San Diego does. They just have a little bit lower total, and you're basically overpaying to be contrarian. But that makes them somewhat interesting in tournaments. But I understand why they're not getting the same sort of ownership as the Padres or the Orioles. They have the lower total, and they are mostly more expensive. Sean V said Gavin Williams seems like he's been on a short leash. He threw 84 pitches last time out, went 3 2/3, got into trouble. They took him out. 94 pitches to start before that in 5 innings, 89 to start before that in 5 1/3. Pitch count's been fine. They've been actually giving him the opportunities to get through that final inning as opposed to pulling him at 78 pitches or whatever. He just hasn't been able to do it. So I don't think it's a leash thing. I think it's been an inefficiency and a lack of ability to get guys out thing. Just an effectiveness thing. But the pitch counts are fine. Like if Gavin Williams actually just goes out there and pitches well, there's nothing that we have seen from a pitch count standpoint or the way Cleveland has handled his innings makes me think that if he were at, let's say he's given up no runs and he's thrown 76 pitches through 5 innings, I'd be very surprised if he's not getting the 6th inning. Even if he's at 80 pitches through 5, I'd be pretty surprised if he's not getting that 6th inning if he's pitching well, just based on the opportunities that they've given so far. The Tigers are, I think, a little bit better version of Miami and Washington. Offensively, they are basically between the Nats and Washington, the Nats and the Marlins in WRC plus against right-handed pitching. But they do have a better matchup here. I do think Gavin Williams is a promising young pitcher. I think Gavin Williams is obviously not at the same level as Dylan Cease and Corbin Burns at this point in his career. He's not getting as much ownership, but he is still getting 16, 17%. So you do get negative correlation by going to these cheap Tigers, or in Riley Green's case, expensive, very good Tiger, against Williams. Of the 3 sub-4 implied run totals that we've talked about, the Nats, the Marlins, and the Tigers are the one that I would want to get to the most. And they're still not getting that much ownership. So Justin Henry, Malloy, Riley Green, both look pretty good. If Vierling is leading off with MPE, I don't have any issue with that. We did get their lineup. He's batting fifth, actually. But you have Wencio Perez leading off, Colt Keith hitting second, Malloy, Green, Vierling, Bly Madrid hitting sixth, McKinstry seven, Rogers eight, Baez nine. My God, the bottom of this lineup is terrible. But 1 through 5 is pretty good. So I simultaneously like Gavin Williams even a little bit more than I thought I did after seeing this lineup and how the bottom of it looks. But also the top of this order as a negative correlation stack looks pretty good. And obviously, if you're stacking the top, you have 3-4 guys from the top, you can mix in one of these weaker hitters from the bottom. Jake Rogers in particular obviously does give you some power upside at catcher, which is fine. But yeah, pretty interesting spot. Wouldn't be surprised at all if I am pretty heavy on Williams and also just playing the Tigers in like my non-Williams lineups, at least as mini stacks. So like at their ownership, they're a perfectly fine team that you can mix in with the Padres, for example. So pretty interesting game there. White Sox facing the Rangers in Texas. Max Scherzer pitching for the Rangers. Jonathan Cannon going for the White Sox. Cannon, again, another cheap pitcher that just doesn't really look very useful on this slate. The Rangers aren't as good an offense as the Orioles or the Padres, but they are still very difficult to strike out. Cannon doesn't get a lot of strikeouts. When he's on, he does get ground balls, but that doesn't necessarily translate to DFS points unless he just happens to get like 18 or 21 of them at people. So I don't really see much reason to be getting to Cannon. Scherzer, on the other hand, does look good. 8,600 facing the White Sox. We know that you can play pretty much anybody against the White Sox. They're 10th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year. They have an 84 WRC+. They're one of the worst offenses in baseball. Scherzer's strikeout numbers, since returning from the injured list, are not very good. He has only struck out 20% of hitters, but I'm not overly concerned about that when you look at who he has faced. He faced Kansas City, Baltimore, San Diego. Those are 3 of the most difficult teams to strike out for a right-handed pitcher. Then he faced the Angels. He got 6 strikeouts. Then he faced Houston, very difficult team to strike out, still got 6. And then he faced Baltimore, went 2 innings, got 1 strikeout. I don't have any concerns about his strikeout numbers so far because of those matchups. My one concern is his last start. He went 2 innings and got pulled after 53 pitches. They said it was because of arm fatigue. The fact that he's pitching today makes me think that they're comfortable that it's not an issue and that he's just going to be full go. But there's got to be, it's obviously greater than 0% that like he gets to the 3rd inning today and just goes, oh shit, this is happening again. So there is some level of risk that you just get a short outing from Scherzer. But the fact that they just, brought him right back and that he is obviously a veteran pitcher, he knows his body. I think it's more likely than not that he's just fine. But, there is some level of risk there after we see him just get pulled after 2 innings because his arm is tired last start. That doesn't make me feel very comfortable. But from a strikeout standpoint, I'm not really worried about what he's done so far this year. Just, to reiterate, Kansas City against right-handed pitching ranks 28th in strikeout percentage. San Diego ranks 29th. The Orioles rank 24th. I want to walk back what I said about the Orioles earlier. I was confused when I said it, but I didn't double check it. They rank 15th in strikeout percentage against left-handed pitching. They are 24th against right-handed pitching. So I was looking at the wrong screen earlier. It doesn't matter, but I just wanted to correct that. So Orioles 24th, Houston 25th in strikeout percentage. So it's been, even the Angels are 17th in strikeout percentage. He hasn't faced a team yet this year that ranks in the top half of the league in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching. So, yeah, and actually, that's a good call. July 14th against Houston, 4 innings, 71 pitches. So 2 starts ago. He also was pulled early. Good point from Julian in chat. So I do have some concerns about how many pitches he's throwing here. Also, some concerns, like not only are you kind of definitely trying to avoid, the, oh shit, this is happening again in the 2nd or 3rd inning. But what happens if he is at 80 pitches after 5 innings? Does he get a 6th inning? At $8,600 when he's only $600 less than Cease and he's only, $900 less than Burns on a slate where I don't think salary is going to matter that much. That's a big deal when Burns is going to go as deep as he can. Cease doesn't have any sort of leash. So as we talk through this, I do still like Scherzer because of the matchup and all of that. And you don't have to go back very far for us to have this conversation about a Rangers pitcher against the White Sox that might be limited, and then they're just not. John Gray hadn't thrown more than 80 pitches since the middle of May. and he comes out and throws like 7+ innings a couple starts ago. So again, there is certainly a good chance that Scherzer just isn't limited at all. Gives you a full start. 3 starts ago, he threw 95 pitches. Very good chance he just does that. But I am, as we talk through it, just getting a little bit more nervous when you compare him to Cease, when you compare him to Burns, and when you consider that he's getting the same owner, he's getting more ownership than Burns. He's getting the same ownership basically as Cease. I don't know. I might end up walking him back a little bit just to try and account for that risk. But one or the other, I think he looks like a good play. It's really just debating like grades of how good does he look. And you can determine that based on how many pitches you think he's going to be allowed to throw. For the offenses here, the Rangers are going to look pretty good at going up against Cannon. Doesn't miss a lot of bats. We know the Rangers have a lot of power. They look like the third best stack for me overall. And then 5-mans. Cannon, again, when he's on, he gets ground balls, which is really frustrating. If you're watching the game, you're seeing somebody that doesn't really have good stuff and just gets a lot of weak ground balls. He has only allowed a 106 expected ISO to righties this year, 281 expected WOBA. Lefties have done the bulk of the damage, 214 expected ISO, 346 expected WOBA. Looks like a really, really good spot to be getting to Corey Seager at 5,300. I don't mind Adolis Garcia, even though he is right-handed. He just has a lot of power and he is relatively inexpensive. Heim, 3,500, low, 3,600, good values there. They are getting some ownership. I think it's warranted. Wyatt Langford, Semien, both right-handed, both look okay. But again, I prefer the Seager, Seager in particular. And then Heim and Lowe look like good values. Josh Smith looks pretty good from the left side as well. Jock Rosa said he should be able to go deep against the White Sox. Yeah, from an effectiveness standpoint, for sure. But we're talking about his arm. And that, I don't think after 2 innings against the Orioles, his arm was like, oh shit, it's the Orioles, I'm tired. It's a physical thing. Like we're purely talking about if he's going to be limited physically, not, from an effectiveness standpoint. So, yeah, it's not a matchup thing there. But yeah, agreed. That's kind of my point overall is that like the White Sox are clearly the best matchup he's gotten so far this year. So I'm not worried about any struggles he's had against these better teams previously. White Sox offensively, not looking very good. You can throw them in that bucket with the Nats, with the Marlins, with the Tigers. I do think they look worse than the Tigers. They look pretty similar to the Nats and the Marlins for me. Tampa Bay taking on Toronto in the Rogers Center. So park upgrade for the Rays, but a pretty low total in this one with Chris Bassett taking on Taj Bradley. Bassett, 7,600, getting 26% ownership. Looks warranted to me. Taj Bradley, 9K, getting 15%. Looks warranted to me. Bradley's been great this year. 29.8% strikeout percentage, 3.29 xFIP. One negative for him is that he is generally a reverse splits pitcher. He has a very, very good splitter that he throws more frequently to left-handed hitters. He has a 32% K percentage against lefties so far this year, 27% against righties. Going back to last year, 32% against lefties, 25% to righties. So he does get strikeouts against either side of the plate. It's just more of them against lefties. He has had power issues overall this year, but a little bit more so to righties. 202 expected ISO to right-handed hitters, 180 to lefties. So it is kind of a scary spot for him in that this park plays up right-handed power, and the Blue Jays have a lot of it. They are also a difficult team to strike out. They rank 23rd in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year, 102 WRC+. I think that's why you're seeing less ownership come into Bradley than, say, Scherzer against the White Sox for 400 less, or than Cease or Burns. But it does give you the opportunity in tournaments to, if you have a lineup where you are playing relatively popular hitters and you don't want Dylan Cease's ownership or you don't want Corbin Burns' ownership in that lineup, from a range of outcome standpoint, Taj Bradley can outscore those guys pretty often. It's just that from a median standpoint, he's not going to because the matchup's not as good. But, certainly a spot where you can save some ownership from those guys without sacrificing ceiling. Sean V said Taj Bradley's been much better at home than on the road. That tends to happen when you pitch your home games in Tropicana Field. Chris Bassett, 7,600. Good price tag for him. He's been solid this year. Nothing special, but 21.3% strikeout percentage, 4.19 xFIP. He, if I remember correctly, does have very drastic splits. 24.5% K percentage against righties this year, 18.3% to lefties. Not only do you get like a 6-point difference in strikeout percentage, though, less than or sub 100 expected ISO allowed to righties, 276 expected WOBA allowed to righties, compared to 191 expected ISO to lefties with a 369 expected WOBA. If Chris Bassett just faced nothing but right-handed hitters, he would be like a really good pitcher. Sean V said it was the opposite in previous seasons. Yeah, this is why home road doesn't usually matter. It's a small sample size thing. Like it it doesn't matter. You're going to generally just be better in Tropicana Field. Um, I'm sure he didn't make any Tropicana Field specific adjustments this year to suddenly be better. He's just who he is, and generally going to pitch better in Tropicana Field. Um, we don't have any sort of sample on him. So the only time the home road splits for a pitcher are actually interesting to me are when it's somebody like Aaron Nola that over the course of his entire career has been better in a hitter friendly park like Philadelphia. Then I think you can kind of buy into just, a comfort level with the mound. Every mound is different. Like you can buy into that, but there should be no expectation that Taj Bradley isn't better at Tropicana Field than most parks because Tropicana Field is a worse place to hit than most parks. For Tampa Bay, we don't have their lineup yet, but probably going to be pretty balanced. Palacios is left-handed. Brandon Lau is left-handed. Josh Lowe is left-handed. Rortvedt is left-handed, and Taylor Walls will be hitting left-handed, although Taylor Walls, he can't hit, so it doesn't really matter. But pretty balanced lineup. So I think you're just basically looking at a normal, Chris Bassitt projection. If you were for some reason to get a right-handed Tampa Bay lineup, then you bump his projection. He looks better, but I don't see any reason that you would get that. So he kind of just looks like a completely average pitcher at 7,600. He looks fine. I do think that right now, at least the projected ownership between Bassitt and Williams, the gap is probably bigger than it should be. Like Gavin Williams is comparable to Chris Bassitt from a talent standpoint. It's a comparable matchup. Yeah, I think Bassitt should be a little bit more popular, but I don't think it should be like 2-1 or anything like that. Tampa Bay so far this season does rank 5th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching on their active roster at 25%. They have a 96 WRC plus. They are getting that park bump in Toronto. Offensively, neither of these teams stand out as great to me, although Tampa is showing up 4th most in all stack types and 5-mans. The reason I think Tampa Bay is showing up is that you do have good left-handed hitters here, and you are getting a park bump for a bunch of cheap hitters. Palacios, 3,500, second base outfield eligible. Just looks like a pretty good value. Brandon Lau, I like a lot. He's getting ownership. I think it's warranted. 4,500, power from the left side. Going up against Bassitt. I like Josh Lowe a lot. 4K in the outfield, has some power and speed. Again, Wall's not a good hitter, but if you're stacking Tampa Bay and you're getting to him as like your 5th guy to punch shortstop, okay, fine. But he gives you stolen base upside. He just can't hit. Ben Rortvedt, kind of the same thing at catcher. If you're getting him because he's 3K, he goes with your stack. He's a catcher. That's fine. But Lau and Lowe in particular are the guys I really want here. Palacios looks pretty good as a value play. Also, Toronto's bullpen right now, I'm not sure if I didn't refresh this. They have 2 left-handed relievers in it, and Brendan Little and Genesis Cabrera. Cabrera threw 16 pitches 2 days ago and 17 yesterday. Brendan Little threw 10 2 days ago and 11 yesterday. There's a pretty good chance that the Blue Jays do not have a left-handed reliever today, which does make Palacios, Lau, and Lowe look better because there's a good chance that they're just not facing a lefty. That takes away pinch hit risk for Palacios. You're generally not getting a pinch hitter for Lau or Lowe, but if they don't have a lefty to bring in, you don't have to worry about it. So I do think that's a little bit of a bump for those guys also, that both lefties that the Blue Jays have pitched each of the last 2 days. There's nothing preventing them from pitching a third day, but generally teams don't want to do that. It's also not like Toronto is in any sort of playoff race or anything. So it's less likely that they're going to just say, screw it and bring in a lefty that they don't want to. So that's just, a little bit of a bump for those guys. They looked good anyway, but that just makes them look a little bit better. Paredes, Rosarena, not as good a matchup at all. As I said, Bassitt has been lights out against righties this year, but they are still cheap. They do have power, especially hitting in this park. So they don't look as good to me as lefties do, but they still look fine at sub 10% ownership, especially if you are stacking Tampa Bay. I think it would be a little bit too nitpicky to just be like you're not going to say, oh, I would rather play Taylor Walls than play Randy Rosarena because of Chris Bassitt's splits. And to Julian's point, Taylor Walls is probably hitting 3 home runs at this point, because I've said it 3 times. But that's kind of, you have to keep everything in context. Yes, Chris Bassitt is much better against righties than lefties, but Randy Rosarena and Isaac Paredes are much better hitting home runs than Ben Rortvedt or Taylor Walls. So I would still prefer those guys, even though they're right-handed. But Lau and Lowe, if you're just hand selecting Tampa Bay guys, or where I would start. Toronto on the other side, really difficult matchup for them against Bradley. But as I mentioned, he has given up power this year. So if you're getting to Guerrero or Jansen or Springer, like those guys all still clearly have upside in this park. They're just not that likely to come through, but they are also facing a 15% owned pitcher. I think that Toronto's going a little bit over owned right now, like 10% projected ownership coming into Guerrero, 10% coming into Jansen. They're showing up as optimal like 6 to 7% of the time for me. So Toronto seems like a team that people are actually going to get to a little bit for that negative correlation against Bradley and for their power. I think that's perfectly fine. It just makes me kind of want to play like Detroit instead in what I think is a similar matchup. Good park for power, similar implied run total, a little bit lower ownership if I remember correctly. Um, yeah, I mean like 6% ownership to Malloy, 4% to Green. Like Riley Green is the Tigers equivalent of Vladimir Guerrero, and he's getting half the ownership. Um, Malloy as a value guy getting 6%, whereas Leo Jimenez probably batting eighth or ninth is getting 6% for Toronto. So Toronto's just projected for more ownership. They are, they do have names that you like a little bit more in their lineup, but I think they're in a very similar spot to Detroit. So not to talk anybody off Toronto, but they do kind of just seem like the low probability team that's getting steamed a little bit. Tampa Bay as well with a similar implied run total, but they make a little more sense since they are getting the park upgrade. They do have a decent matchup, and they do have some quality left-handed value bats. No, I don't factor in batter versus pitcher stats at all, period. I do have a model that looks at the types of pitches that pitchers throw and the locations that they throw them and compares it to how hitters do versus their baseline against those pitches and locations, that I adjust my projections with, somewhat based on those. But as far as, what somebody's done against Chris Bassett, I don't care. The reason that I don't care is it's just a sample size thing again. It's not that batter versus pitcher doesn't exist. I guarantee you that some pitchers or some hitters see the ball better from certain pitchers and hit better against them. The problem is that you have no idea who those pitchers, when that is the case, and when it's just a random, oh, this guy hit 3 home runs and 10 at bats randomly against this pitcher, and he's going to go 0 for his next 20 against him. Normally it's not going to be predictive. And then you also have the issue of pitchers are constantly making adjustments in what they throw, how they throw, where they throw, their release point, all of that stuff from potentially the last time somebody faced them. And also aging happens. You have to look too at, like, a lot of times if you were to get people say, well, this guy has a really good sample size against Zach Greinke. He's faced him 100 times, but he's faced him 100 times over 18 years. So, Zach Greinke in 2003 or whatever wasn't the same as Zach Greinke in 2021. So it's just a huge issue. And generally just, you're going to predict what happens going forward better by just looking at the overall talent level of a hitter, the overall talent level of a pitcher, how a pitcher does against, how guys do in certain splits, than you are a pitcher against the hitter. San Francisco taking on the Dodgers in LA. Kershaw, I believe, expected back for the Dodgers. Logan Webb going for, Kershaw wasn't in my data when I first ran this. Tends to happen in the morning when guys are coming back from the injured list. Again, this is why I preferred doing the game-by-game show today as opposed to a tournament show. But Kershaw is expected to start today. He is 8,400 on DraftKings, made 2 rehab starts, 67 pitches in his most recent one. 6-game slate. If you want to get a little bit of him, I think that's fine. I'm not going crazy. I think kind of like the argument for Kershaw, I guess, would be he's probably going to get a lot less ownership at that price point than Scherzer. And let's say he throws 75 pitches, he could beat Scherzer, but still, I would rather probably just be playing. If I'm not going to play Scherzer in that range, I would just play Gavin Williams or Bassett. So 6-game slate. I think you can have some Kershaw. I think it's kind of comparable to like Robbie Ray yesterday. Obviously, I'm not expecting him to do what Robbie Ray did. I'm just saying, I assume he throws around 75 pitches at 8,400. Probably doesn't have the ceiling that you would really like, but there is still a path where Scherzer just doesn't do that well. Williams and Bassett are mediocre, and Kershaw just beats them in 75 pitches. That can happen, but I'm not going to end up getting too much of him, I wouldn't think. Webb on the other side, 8,100. getting about 8% ownership. I have him going under-owned here, which does kind of surprise me, but at the same time, I don't think he should be getting a quarter of the ownership that Max Scherzer is getting. I don't think he should be getting a third of the ownership that Chris Bassett is getting. He's getting half the ownership that Gavin Williams is getting. Webb's not a great strikeout pitcher by any stretch, 20.7% K percentage this year, but he's a good pitcher overall, 3.22 xFIP. And you compare him to the strikeout percentages of these other pitchers that are getting ownership. Bassett's at 21.3%, so they're pretty close. Scherzer this year at 20%. As I mentioned, I don't buy into that number because of who he's faced, but it is what he's at so far this year. Gavin Williams, again, small sample and it's going to come up, but 17%. He's more likely to end up around like 21, 22, 23%. So these guys do have better strikeout stuff than Webb, but it's not by a massive margin necessarily. He is good at preventing runs. The matchup against the Dodgers sucks. The park is good for hitting. All of that is true. Dodgers 13th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching, 116 WRC plus. I understand why Webb's getting less ownership than those guys, and I think he should. I just don't think it should be by the same margin by the margin that he's projected for right now. His range of outcomes is not drastically worse than Gavin Williams or Max Scherzer or Chris Bassett. So I think he's an interesting tournament play. He's somebody that probably looks a little bit more appealing. Like if you're looking at this slate and you're saying, I want to play the Orioles, I want to play the Padres, mix in some Logan Webb with those stacks. If you're looking at it and saying, I want to play the Marlins, I want to play the Tigers, probably don't need Logan Webb because you can just play Corbin Burns and Dylan Cease and whatever other pitching you want to get to. So how much Webb I end up playing probably ultimately depends on how much Padres and Orioles I end up playing. But it does look like a spot that if you need a contrarian pitcher, he is not getting enough ownership. Also keep in mind that this could just come up. A lot of times when I do this show, now granted, normally the slate doesn't start 2 hours after this show or an hour after the show ends. But normally when I do this show, if you see something like, I think this pitcher should be 18% owned from an optimal standpoint, and he's only 8, by the time you get the lock, a lot of times he's like 13 or 14%. So there is also a chance that this ownership number is just low on Webb and that it corrects. But that is an interesting spot to think about. Offensively, I don't mind either of these teams. I think they're both kind of just middle of the road stacks. San Francisco showed up 5th most right now. But again, Kershaw wasn't in my data, so I think that might change. Dodgers were right below them. It's not a good matchup for either team, obviously, but it is a good park. And the Dodgers clearly have a ton of good hitters if you can get to the top of their lineup. The Giants don't have the best hitters, but they are affordable. Chapman at 4,400, Ramos at 4,500. Nothing wrong with those price tags. Soler hasn't been very good overall this year, but we know he does have power at 4,200, and they get a park upgrade here. You do have pinch hit risk, most likely. We don't have a Giants lineup yet, but with Kershaw being left-handed, Wilmer Flores probably will start. 3,100 is a cheap price tag, but once Kershaw leaves the game, you are likely to get Lamont Wade hitting for Flores. Same can be said, depending on what they do in the outfield, like Luis Matos. If he starts, you could be getting Conforto or Yastrzemski, assuming one of them isn't starting later in the game. So for the right-handed platoon bats, do keep in mind there is pinch hit risk, but guys like Chapman, Ramos, Soler, they're not going anywhere, even when a right-handed reliever comes in. And then, again, self-explanatory, getting to Shohei Ohtani looks fine. The problem with the Dodgers is what it always is too, though, as far as stacks go. The top of the order is very, very good and very, very expensive. The bottom of the order is cheap, but for one, they're not very good at hitting. And for two, they generally carry platoon risk. Like if you get the projected lineup that RotoWire has right now, for example, is Ohtani, Smith, Freeman, Hernandez. Obviously, you're happy getting to any of those guys, but they're expensive. Andy Pagas projected to hit 5th. He's fine, whatever. Gavin Lux, Jason Hayward, Chris Taylor, Kike Hernandez. One, most of those guys aren't very good. But two, depending on what the lineup actually is, there is pinch hit risk. Like if Chris Taylor is starting, Lux has a little bit less pinch hit risk. They do have Nick Ahmed, though, that could come in for Lux if or when a left-handed reliever comes in. In the outfield, off the top of my head, I'm not sure who they have for Hayward. But Lux and Hayward in that situation would carry some pinch hit risk. Taylor and Hernandez would have left since they're starting against the righty. So ultimately, just be careful with the left-handed platoon bats, whoever they are, that are in the lineup for the Dodgers here. So to recap, Padres and Orioles pretty clearly look like the top 2 stacks today. Rangers are 3rd. And then a lot of other teams just look very similar. Tampa Bay, Detroit, Toronto, Cleveland, San Francisco, Dodgers. Like they're all just kind of lumped together here. Washington and Miami look like the 2 worst stacks. Not really surprising because Corbin Burns and Dylan Cease are pretty clearly your 2 best pitchers on the slate as far as talent level goes. Scherzer, looks like a good mid-range value. Bassett looks like a good value, a little bit less than that. Gavin Williams is your natural Chris Bassett pivot, just very similar range of outcomes and a little bit less ownership. Logan Webb is your natural Max Scherzer pivot, a lot less ownership, similar price range. Kershaw is in there as well, probably limited. And then Taj Bradley is your natural pivot to Dylan Cease and Corbin Burns, getting around half the ownership of those guys with a similar range of outcomes. So pretty interesting pitching slate where like it's very clear where you should go from a projection standpoint, but from a range of outcome standpoint, there's a lot of guys that have a similar range of outcomes to the pitchers that everybody's going to go to. Steven Leibowitz said, are the Tigers your favorite contrarian stack? Yes. At current ownership projections, yes, because they do negatively correlate with a relatively popular Williams. They do get a good park to hit home runs in. They are getting less ownership than like Toronto. You're getting similar ownership to like Miami and Washington. So yeah, I think so. Better park than either of them, better matchup than either of them. Yeah, I think they're my favorite contrarian stack. I wouldn't really expect that to change either. Yeah, so I think that's all I have for this show. Again, don't forget, lock is at 12:05. Don't forget to sign up for Endgame Syndicate using the link in the description below. We have a bunch of videos up talking process, talking about the ways that we approach MLB DFS. We will have videos up coming shortly for NFL DFS. We have our end of the month roundtable, which is a live Q&A session for members coming up at the end of the month as well. And again, if you hadn't already heard somehow, that's Utical, Nerdy Tanner, Brick75, and myself offering intermediate and advanced DFS strategy, helping you get better as players, helping you make some more money that way. So check that out if you haven't already. Good luck on the slate today, and then enjoy the rest of your Thursday off.